On the evening of November 1907, the most powerful men on Wall Street found themselves trapped inside J.P. Morgan's private library, locked in by the 68-year-old financier who held the key to both the room and the American economy. Outside, panic gripped financial markets as banks collapsed, stocks plummeted, and ordinary Americans rushed to withdraw their life savings before their institutions failed. Inside the ornate library, Morgan calmly played solitaire while bank presidents, steel magnates, and railroad barons argued over who would sacrifice millions to prevent the complete collapse of the United States financial system. This wasn't a government bailout or Federal Reserve intervention. Those institutions didn't exist yet. Instead, the fate of American capitalism rested in the hands of one man who controlled more wealth than most countries and possessed the authority to force his competitors to choose between personal profit and national survival. Morgan's unprecedented display of private financial power that night saved the economy, but also demonstrated the terrifying concentration of influence that a single individual could wield over the entire nation's prosperity. The decisions made in that locked library would prevent economic catastrophe, while simultaneously convincing lawmakers that no private citizen should ever again possess such enormous control over public welfare. This is the story of the last time a private banker acted as America's de facto central bank, and how one night of forced cooperation changed the balance between private wealth and public financial policy forever. The America that J.P. Morgan dominated in 1907 represented a unique moment in financial history, when private banking power had grown to unprecedented levels, while government financial oversight remained virtually non-existent. The Federal Reserve System wouldn't be established until 1913, leaving the nation's monetary policy and financial stability largely in the hands of private institutions and individuals who operated with minimal regulatory constraint. This regulatory vacuum created opportunities for extraordinary personal influence that would be unimaginable in modern financial systems. John Pierpont Morgan's position within this system represented something unprecedented in American economic history, a private citizen who functioned as an unofficial central banker with the authority to stabilize or destabilize the entire national economy. His influence extended beyond simple wealth accumulation to encompass control over railroad systems, steel production, banking networks, and international finance that made him effectively more powerful than government officials in determining American economic policy. The J.P. Morgan and Company banking house that served as the center of this influence operated from a modest building at 23 Wall Street, yet its financial reach extended across continents and industries. Morgan's banking empire included controlling interests in major railroads, steel companies, and financial institutions that collectively employed millions of Americans and controlled substantial portions of national economic infrastructure. This concentration of power in private hands reflected the laissez-faire economic philosophy that dominated American politics during the Gilded Age. The financial system that existed in 1907, America lacked many of the safety mechanisms that modern economies take for granted. No deposit insurance protected ordinary savers from bank failures. No central bank could inject liquidity during financial crises. No government agency regulated securities trading or corporate mergers. This regulatory absence created both tremendous opportunities for private profit and enormous vulnerabilities to financial panics that could devastate the entire economy within days or weeks. International economic relationships that connected American markets to European financial centers created additional complexities and vulnerabilities that private bankers like Morgan had to navigate without government support or coordination. American banks depended on London money markets for financing, while European investors held substantial positions in American railroads and industrial companies. These international connections meant that financial problems in one country could rapidly spread across the Atlantic, creating challenges that required sophisticated understanding of global monetary relationships. The technological infrastructure that supported early 20th century finance operated through telegraph networks, newspaper reporting, and personal communication systems that were primitive by modern standards, yet sophisticated enough to enable rapid information transmission that could trigger financial panics within hours. Stock market information traveled from New York to San Francisco in minutes, while international financial news could reach American markets within days of European developments. Corporate structure and business organization. In 1907, America reflected the enormous industrial consolidation that had occurred during the previous 2 decades, creating massive trusts and monopolies that controlled entire industries. Morgan's role in organizing these consolidations through his banking operations had made him a central figure in what historians call the merger movement that transformed American business from small-scale entrepreneurship to large-scale corporate capitalism. The social and political context surrounding Morgan's financial dominance included growing public concern about concentrated wealth and corporate power that would eventually lead to progressive reform movements and antitrust legislation. However, in 1907, these reform efforts remained largely ineffective, leaving private financiers with enormous freedom to operate according to their own judgment rather than public oversight or democratic accountability. Regional financial relationships that connected Wall Street to local banks throughout the country created a web of dependencies and vulnerabilities that could transmit financial problems from New York to rural communities within days. Local banks in small towns depended on correspondent relationships with larger urban institutions for services and liquidity, making them vulnerable to problems that originated hundreds of miles away in financial centers they had minimal connection to or understanding of. The psychological and cultural factors that influenced financial market behavior in 1907 included public confidence in private financial leadership that would seem extraordinary by contemporary standards. Many Americans trusted established bankers like Morgan more than they trusted government officials, viewing private financial expertise as superior to political management of economic affairs. This cultural attitude provided private bankers with moral authority to act decisively during crises, while simultaneously creating expectations that they would use their power responsibly for public benefit. Labor and industrial relationships that underpinned the American economy in 1907 reflected the massive immigration, urbanization, and industrialization that had transformed the nation during the preceding decades. The financial decisions made by Morgan and his peers directly affected employment, wages, and living conditions for millions of American workers who had no direct voice in the private negotiations that determined their economic fate. International competition from European financial centers, particularly London, created pressure on American bankers to maintain the credibility and stability of domestic markets in order to attract and retain international investment. America's emergence as a global economic power required demonstrating financial sophistication and crisis management capabilities that could compete with established European financial institutions. The specific economic conditions that prevailed during 1907 included the aftermath of the 1906 San Francisco earthquake, ongoing concerns about trust-busting prosecutions, and international monetary tensions that created multiple sources of financial instability. These underlying problems meant that American financial markets were already vulnerable when the specific events that triggered the panic began unfolding in October 1907. As autumn arrived in 1907, the American economy faced a perfect storm of financial pressures that would test whether private banking power could actually substitute for government financial management, and whether one man's authority could prove sufficient to prevent the collapse of an entire national economy. Let me take you back to the world's first modern financial crisis, when the fate of American capitalism rested entirely in private hands. Chapter 1. Financial Titan. John Pierpont. Morgan's transformation from successful banker to unofficial central banker of the United States occurred gradually throughout the 1880s and 1890s as his financial influence expanded beyond traditional banking services to encompass control over entire industries and economic sectors. By 1907, the 68-year-old financier commanded resources and authority that exceeded those of most sovereign governments, yet operated through private institutions that answered to no democratic oversight or public accountability. Morgan's banking philosophy reflected both his Presbyterian religious upbringing and his practical experience in international finance, combining moral certainty about proper business conduct with sophisticated understanding of global monetary relationships. He viewed himself as a steward of American capitalism, who bore responsibility for maintaining financial stability and promoting economic development, even when such stewardship required making decisions that affected millions of people without their consent or input. The physical presence that Morgan commanded in financial circles reflected both his imposing personality and his reputation for decisive action during economic crises. Standing over 6 feet tall with piercing eyes and a commanding voice, he dominated meetings and negotiations through sheer force of personality, combined with his demonstrated ability to mobilize enormous financial resources quickly and effectively. Contemporary accounts describe him as intimidating, even to powerful business leaders who were themselves accustomed to wielding substantial authority. J.P. Morgan and Company's position within the American banking system by 1907 represented unprecedented concentration of financial power that enabled Morgan to function as a private Federal Reserve decades before such an institution officially existed. His bank served as the primary source of liquidity for major corporations, the leading underwriter of government bonds, and the most important intermediary between American businesses and European capital markets. This central position gave him unique visibility into economic conditions and unmatched ability to coordinate financial responses to emerging problems. The international relationships that Morgan had cultivated over decades of transatlantic finance provided him with resources and information that no government agency possessed. His partnerships with leading European banking houses, particularly the Rothschild family banks, enabled him to access foreign capital markets and coordinate international financial policy in ways that individual nations could not achieve through diplomatic channels alone. These relationships proved crucial during the 1907 crisis, when international cooperation became essential for stabilizing American markets. Morgan's role in organizing major industrial consolidations during the 1890s and early 1900s had established his authority over key sectors of the American economy that extended far beyond simple banking services. His participation in creating U.S. Steel, General Electric, and International Harvester gave him influence over employment, wages, and industrial production that affected millions of American workers and consumers. This industrial power complemented his financial authority to create unprecedented private control over economic policy. The information networks that Morgan maintained through his business relationships provided him with real-time intelligence about economic conditions that surpassed government data collection and analysis capabilities. His agents and partners in major cities throughout America and Europe reported daily on local financial conditions, enabling him to anticipate and respond to emerging problems before they became public knowledge. This information advantage proved crucial for effective crisis management. Morgan's personal wealth, while substantial, represented only a fraction of the total financial resources he could mobilize through his institutional relationships and personal reputation. His ability to organize lending syndicates, coordinate investment strategies, and persuade other financiers to support particular policies gave him effective control over financial resources that exceeded those available to most national governments. This leverage enabled him to implement economic policies without requiring legislative approval or democratic mandate. The legal and regulatory environment that existed in 1907 provided Morgan with almost unlimited freedom to operate according to his personal judgment rather than external oversight or constraint. Antitrust laws remained largely ineffective, banking regulation was minimal, and securities markets operated with virtually no government supervision. This regulatory vacuum created opportunities for private authority that would be impossible under modern financial oversight systems. Morgan's understanding of monetary policy and central banking reflected his extensive study of European financial institutions and his practical experience managing international capital flows. He understood the theoretical principles underlying central bank operations, while possessing the practical authority to implement such policies through private institutions and personal relationships. This combination of knowledge and power made him uniquely qualified to serve as an unofficial central banker during financial emergencies. The psychological impact of Morgan's reputation on financial market behavior created a form of private authority that operated independently of his actual financial resources or institutional control. Market participants trusted his judgment and followed his leadership during crises, enabling him to influence economic conditions through confidence and reputation as much as through direct financial intervention. This psychological authority proved essential for maintaining stability during periods of panic and uncertainty. Morgan's relationship with government officials reflected the informal nature of financial policy coordination that existed before the creation of formal central banking institutions. He maintained close personal relationships with presidents, treasury secretaries, and congressional leaders who often consulted with him about economic policy and relied on his private resources to implement public financial objectives. These relationships created an unofficial partnership between private finance and public authority that shaped American economic policy. The organizational structure of Morgan's financial empire encompassed not just J.P. Morgan and Company, but also extensive partnerships and alliances with other major financial institutions that enabled coordinated action across the entire American banking system. His influence extended through formal business relationships, personal friendships, and shared economic interests that created networks of cooperation and mutual support among the nation's leading financiers. The technological infrastructure that supported Morgan's operations included private telegraph networks, international cable systems, and communication arrangements that enabled rapid coordination of financial activities across vast distances. His ability to communicate instantly with partners in London, Paris, and major American cities provided operational capabilities that government agencies lacked, making private coordination more effective than official diplomatic channels for managing international financial relationships. By 1907, Morgan had become something unprecedented in American history, a private citizen with the authority and resources to function as the nation's central banker, yet with no democratic accountability or public oversight to constrain his power. This unique position would be tested to its limits when financial crisis struck in October 1907, forcing him to choose between personal profit and public responsibility, while demonstrating both the potential and the dangers of concentrated private financial power. Chapter 2. Market Tremors. The financial vulnerabilities that would trigger the panic of 1907 had been building throughout the year as a combination of domestic economic pressures and international monetary tensions created multiple stress points in the American financial system. The aftereffects of the 1906 San Francisco earthquake had drained insurance company reserves and disrupted West Coast banking relationships, while ongoing antitrust prosecutions created uncertainty about the future of major corporations and their securities values. The copper market speculation that served as the immediate catalyst for the panic reflected the broader climate of risk-taking and financial innovation that characterized early 20th century American capitalism. F. Augustus Heinze, a Montana copper magnate, had attempted to corner the copper market through a complex scheme involving multiple bank loans and stock manipulations that ultimately failed and threatened the solvency of several financial institutions connected to his operations. Knickerbocker Trust Company's involvement in Heinze's copper speculation represented the dangerous interconnections between speculative finance and mainstream banking that characterized the unregulated financial system of 1907. The Knickerbocker Trust was one of New York's largest financial institutions, serving wealthy individuals and major corporations who trusted the bank to maintain conservative investment policies. When the bank's president was revealed to have participated in Heinze's failed scheme, public confidence in the institution collapsed almost immediately. The trust company structure that had evolved in New York during the early 1900s created regulatory gaps that allowed these institutions to engage in riskier activities than traditional banks, while maintaining the public appearance of conservative financial management. Trust companies operated with fewer regulatory constraints than national banks, enabling them to invest in speculative ventures and real estate developments that traditional banks were prohibited from pursuing. This regulatory arbitrage created systemic risks that few observers understood until the crisis exposed them. International gold flows that had been supporting American financial markets throughout 1907 began reversing in October as European investors became concerned about American economic conditions and began repatriating their capital. The gold standard that governed international monetary relationships meant that these capital flows directly affected domestic money supply and interest rates, creating additional pressure on American financial institutions that were already strained by domestic problems. J.P. Morgan's initial response to emerging signs of financial stress reflected his sophisticated understanding of market psychology and crisis dynamics. Rather than immediately intervening with public statements or financial support, he began quietly gathering information about the extent of various institutions' exposure to problematic investments, while simultaneously assessing the resources available for potential rescue operations. This cautious approach reflected his understanding that premature action could sometimes worsen panic conditions. The communication networks that connected major financial institutions in 1907 New York operated primarily through personal relationships, private meetings, and informal information sharing that made coordinated responses to emerging crises both possible and necessary. Bank presidents and trust company officers met regularly at exclusive clubs and business organizations where they exchanged information about market conditions and potential problems before such information became public knowledge. Federal and state regulatory authorities' limited role in financial oversight meant that private bankers like Morgan possessed better information about emerging crises than government officials who lacked both the legal authority and the practical capability to monitor complex financial relationships. Treasury Department officials in Washington remained largely unaware of the developing problems until they had already reached crisis proportions, leaving private finance to manage the situation without government coordination or support. The newspaper and media coverage of emerging financial problems in October 1907 reflected the limited financial journalism capabilities of the era, while simultaneously demonstrating the media's power to accelerate panic conditions through sensationalized reporting. Financial reporters lacked the sophisticated understanding of complex banking relationships that would have enabled accurate assessment of crisis conditions, often relying on rumors and speculation that increased public anxiety rather than providing useful information. International financial relationships that connected American markets to European capital created both vulnerabilities and potential sources of support as the crisis developed. Morgan's extensive partnerships with London banking houses provided access to foreign resources that could help stabilize American markets, but these same international connections also meant that American financial problems could rapidly spread to European institutions, if not contained quickly and effectively. The industrial economy that underpinned American financial markets in 1907 had been experiencing mixed signals throughout the year, with some sectors showing strong growth while others faced declining demand and increased competition. Railroad companies, steel manufacturers, and other major corporations that formed the foundation of stock market values were dealing with regulatory uncertainties and changing competitive conditions that affected their securities prices and borrowing capabilities. Morgan's assessment of the developing crisis throughout October 1907 reflected his unique position as both a major market participant and an unofficial financial authority responsible for maintaining system-wide stability. His private analysis had to balance his firm's commercial interests against his broader responsibility for preventing financial collapse, creating complex decision-making pressures that few individuals in history have faced. The seasonal patterns that affected financial markets in 1907 included the agricultural cycle, that typically created increased demand for credit during harvest seasons, putting additional pressure on banking system liquidity at precisely the time when international capital flows were becoming less favorable. These seasonal factors meant that the developing crisis occurred during a period when financial institutions were already strained by normal cyclical demands. Personal relationships among New York's financial elite created both opportunities for cooperation and potential conflicts of interest as individual institutions faced different levels of exposure to problematic investments. The social networks that connected major bankers through family ties, club memberships, and business partnerships could facilitate coordinated responses to crises while also creating pressure for mutual support that might conflict with sound business judgment. As October 1907 progressed toward its conclusion, the multiple stress factors affecting American financial markets were converging toward a crisis point that would test whether private banking leadership could substitute for government financial management in maintaining economic stability. The vulnerabilities that had been building for months were about to be exposed by specific events that would transform a manageable financial problem into a full-scale panic requiring unprecedented private intervention to prevent economic collapse. Chapter 3. Panic erupts. October 16, 1907, marked the beginning of a financial avalanche when news broke that Charles W. Morse, a prominent financier known as the Ice King, had been quietly accumulating control over multiple banks and trust companies through questionable methods that violated both legal regulations and established banking practices. Morse's empire, built on interlocking directorates and circular lending arrangements, suddenly appeared vulnerable to collapse, threatening institutions that controlled hundreds of millions of dollars in deposits and loans throughout the New York financial district. The revelation of F. Augustus Heinz's failed attempt to corner the copper market provided the specific catalyst that transformed general market anxiety into focused panic. Heinz's scheme had involved borrowing massive amounts of money using copper stocks as collateral, then attempting to drive up copper prices through manipulated trading that would have generated enormous profits if successful. When the manipulation failed, his loans became uncollectible and threatened multiple financial institutions that had participated in the scheme. Knickerbocker Trust Company found itself at the center of the developing storm when its president, Charles T. Barney, was forced to resign on October 21st after his connections to the Heinz copper speculation became public knowledge. The Knickerbocker Trust was the third largest trust company in New York, managing over $60 million in deposits for wealthy individuals, corporations, and institutional investors who had trusted the institution to maintain conservative investment policies. The bank run that began at Knickerbocker Trust on October 22nd represented the terrifying spectacle of financial panic in its most visible form. Lines of depositors stretched for blocks around the company's headquarters at 5th Avenue and 34th Street, with anxious customers demanding immediate withdrawal of their funds, regardless of the inconvenience or financial loss such precipitous action might create. The psychological contagion of panic spread faster than rational analysis of the institution's actual financial condition. Trust companies throughout New York experienced similar runs as depositors lost confidence, not just in specific institutions, but in the entire trust company structure that had grown rapidly during the previous decade without adequate regulatory oversight or public understanding. The panic revealed fundamental weaknesses in financial institutions that had operated successfully during normal times but proved vulnerable to sudden withdrawals during crisis periods. The stock market collapse that accompanied the banking panic saw the Dow Jones Industrial Average fall more than 30% in 3 weeks, wiping out hundreds of millions of dollars in market value while creating margin calls and forced liquidations that amplified the financial destruction. Securities that had been considered safe investments became virtually unsaleable as buyers disappeared and sellers competed desperately to convert their holdings into cash. Regional banks throughout the United States began experiencing pressure as news of New York's financial problems spread through telegraph networks and newspaper reports that carried panic westward faster than accurate information about actual conditions. Local institutions that had no direct connection to the failed copper speculation or problematic trust companies found themselves facing worried depositors who demanded explanations and reassurances that bank officers were often unable to provide convincingly. J.P. Morgan's initial public response to the developing crisis reflected his understanding that premature intervention might be interpreted as evidence that conditions were worse than generally recognized, potentially accelerating panic rather than containing it. Instead of immediate public statements, he began conducting private consultations with other major bankers to assess the scope of the problem and determine what resources might be available for coordinated response efforts. The absence of a central bank or government deposit insurance meant that financial institutions facing runs had limited options for obtaining emergency liquidity beyond private arrangements with other bankers who might be experiencing their own pressures. Traditional sources of emergency funding, including correspondent banking relationships and established credit lines, proved inadequate for addressing the scale of simultaneous withdrawals that characterized the 1907 panic. International financial markets began showing signs of strain as European investors became aware of American financial problems and started reducing their exposure to American securities and banking relationships. The global interconnections that had facilitated American economic growth during prosperous periods now threatened to transmit domestic financial problems to international markets that might amplify and return the crisis to American institutions with increased severity. The psychological aspects of financial panic that became evident during late October 1907 demonstrated the power of fear and uncertainty to override rational economic analysis and create self-fulfilling prophecies of financial collapse. Depositors who understood intellectually that their banks remained solvent nonetheless joined withdrawal lines because they feared that other depositors' actions might create the very insolvency they worried about. Media coverage of the developing crisis reflected both the limited financial journalism capabilities of the era and the media's unintentional role in accelerating panic through sensationalized reporting that emphasized dramatic stories over careful analysis. Newspaper accounts of bank runs and market collapses reached national audiences within hours, spreading fear and uncertainty to regions that had no direct connection to the problematic New York institutions. Corporate borrowers who depended on short-term credit facilities found themselves unable to refinance maturing obligations as banks conserved liquidity and avoided new lending commitments during the uncertain period. This credit contraction threatened to spread financial problems beyond the banking sector to industrial and commercial enterprises that required ongoing access to working capital for normal operations. The government's limited response capabilities became evident as Treasury Department officials and congressional leaders recognized that they lacked both the legal authority and the practical resources necessary for addressing a financial crisis of this magnitude. President Theodore Roosevelt's administration could offer moral support and limited cooperation, but actual crisis management would have to come from private sources with the resources and authority to take effective action. As October 1907 drew to a close, the financial panic had evolved from a specific problem involving copper speculation and questionable trust company practices into a systemic crisis that threatened the stability of the entire American banking system. The stage was set for J.P. Morgan's unprecedented intervention that would test whether private financial leadership could substitute for government authority in maintaining economic stability during the most severe crisis American capitalism had yet faced. Chapter 4. Library Lockdown. The decision to convene Wall Street's most powerful financiers in J.P. Morgan's private library on the evening of November 2, 1907, represented an extraordinary assertion of private authority over public economic policy that had no precedent in American history. Morgan's East 36th Street mansion, with its magnificent library designed by Charles McKim, became the command center for managing a financial crisis that threatened to destroy the American economy within days if decisive action was not taken immediately. The invitation list for that historic evening reflected Morgan's assessment of which individuals possessed both the financial resources and the institutional authority necessary for implementing an effective response to the accelerating crisis. Bank presidents, trust company officers, and major industrialists who controlled hundreds of millions of dollars in assets received urgent summons to attend what they understood would be crucial negotiations about preventing complete financial collapse. Morgan's personal preparation for the evening demonstrated his understanding that the meeting would require not just financial negotiation, but psychological manipulation and coercive diplomacy that would test his ability to force powerful men to subordinate their personal interests to collective survival. He had spent the day reviewing financial reports, consulting with trusted advisors, and planning strategies for compelling cooperation from individuals who were accustomed to making independent decisions without external pressure. The physical setting of the library itself contributed to the psychological pressure that Morgan intended to create during the negotiations. The room's ornate decoration, valuable artwork, and impressive collection of rare books and manuscripts reflected both Morgan's cultural sophistication and his enormous wealth, creating an environment that emphasized his authority while simultaneously reminding attendees of the stakes involved in the evening's decisions. The lock that Morgan employed to prevent participants from leaving the library until agreements were reached represented an unprecedented violation of personal freedom that demonstrated his willingness to use extreme methods to achieve essential objectives. No private citizen in American history had previously possessed both the authority to compel attendance by powerful individuals and the confidence to physically restrain them until they agreed to his demands. The agenda that guided the evening's discussions focused on specific institutions and financial arrangements that required immediate attention to prevent their collapse from triggering broader systemic failure. Moore & Schley, a major brokerage firm that had become overextended through speculative investments, needed immediate liquidity support to avoid bankruptcy that would have destroyed confidence in securities markets and accelerated the ongoing panic. The Trust Company of America, another major institution facing depositor runs, required coordinated support from multiple banks to maintain operations while rebuilding public confidence through demonstrated financial backing. The company's potential failure would have eliminated a major source of credit for businesses and individuals throughout the New York metropolitan area, while creating additional pressure on other financial institutions. The negotiation dynamics that developed during the evening reflected the complex relationships among participants who were simultaneously competitors and potential collaborators in addressing shared threats to their collective interests. Personal animosities, business rivalries, and conflicting commercial objectives had to be set aside in favor of coordinated action that would benefit all participants through preserved systemic stability. Morgan's role as both negotiation leader and ultimate decision-maker required him to balance competing claims and interests while maintaining sufficient authority to enforce agreements that individual participants might prefer to avoid. His position as the only person capable of unlocking the library door provided physical enforcement for his authority, while his reputation for keeping his word provided assurance that any agreements reached would be honored. The financial calculations that underpinned the evening's negotiations involved commitments totaling tens of millions of dollars that would be contributed by various participants according to their ability to pay and their stake in preventing systemic collapse. These calculations required detailed analysis of each institution's financial condition, assessment of minimum support requirements for preventing failure, and allocation of costs among parties who had different levels of exposure to the crisis. Information sharing that occurred during the locked door session provided participants with unprecedented insight into their competitors' financial conditions and strategic thinking, while creating mutual vulnerability that could facilitate future cooperation or potential exploitation. The enforced intimacy of the situation broke down normal barriers to communication while creating shared responsibility for crisis management decisions. The legal implications of the evening's coercive negotiations raised questions about antitrust violations, restraint of trade, and abuse of private power that would later influence progressive reform efforts aimed at preventing similar concentrations of private authority. The participants were effectively engaging in monopolistic cooperation to control financial markets, yet doing so for the stated purpose of preventing economic collapse that would harm public interests. International considerations that influenced the negotiations included the need to maintain American financial credibility with European investors and central banks who might provide additional support if convinced that domestic financial leadership was competent and coordinated. The participants understood that their decisions would be evaluated by international observers who could either support or undermine American financial recovery efforts. The communication protocols that governed interaction with the outside world during the evening required careful management to prevent premature disclosure of negotiation details that might undermine market confidence, while ensuring that essential information reached appropriate parties who needed to implement specific agreements. Messages sent from the library had to balance transparency with discretion to avoid creating additional panic. The time pressure that characterized the negotiations reflected the reality that financial markets would resume operations the following morning, with conditions that would either reflect successful crisis management or accelerated collapse, depending on the evening's outcomes. Participants understood that they had only hours to reach agreements that would determine the immediate future of American capitalism. As midnight approached on November 2, 1907, the locked-door negotiations in Morgan's library were approaching their climax, with participants facing the final choice between personal financial sacrifice and collective economic survival that would define both their individual legacies and the future structure of American financial regulation.
Chapter 5. Midnight Negotiations. The marathon negotiations that continued through the night of November 2nd, 1907, in Morgan's locked library represented the most intensive and consequential private financial diplomacy in American history. As exhaustion mounted and tempers frayed, the participants grappled with decisions that would commit their institutions to enormous financial risks while determining whether American capitalism would survive its greatest crisis to date.
The specific terms being negotiated centered on a $25 million rescue fund that would be distributed among threatened institutions according to carefully calculated formulas that balanced each firm's need for support against the contributing bank's ability to provide assistance without jeopardizing their own stability. These calculations required detailed analysis of balance sheets, assessment of depositor confidence levels, and predictions about future market conditions that would determine the rescue effort's ultimate success. Morgan's negotiating strategy involved alternating between personal charm and implicit threats, using his reputation for both generosity and ruthlessness to persuade reluctant participants that cooperation served their enlightened self-interest, while resistance would result in consequences worse than the costs of participation. His ability to remain calm and focused during the intense discussions provided psychological stability that helped other participants manage their own stress and anxiety. The resistance that emerged from some participants reflected legitimate concerns about committing their institutions to financial obligations that might prove impossible to fulfill if crisis conditions worsened rather than improved. Bank presidents, who had fiduciary responsibilities to their own depositors and shareholders, questioned whether they possessed the legal authority to risk their institutions' assets for the broader public benefit that rescue efforts were intended to achieve. Information asymmetries among the participants created additional negotiating complexities, as different individuals possessed varying levels of knowledge about specific institutions' true financial conditions and the likely effectiveness of proposed rescue measures. Morgan's superior access to detailed financial intelligence gave him significant advantages in structuring agreements that would actually work while appearing fair to participants who lacked complete information. The legal documentation required for implementing the rescue agreements had to be drafted during the night-long session, using legal expertise available among the participants and their advisors, creating binding commitments that could be implemented immediately when markets reopened without requiring extended legal review or regulatory approval. These hastily drafted documents would govern the distribution of millions of dollars based on handshake agreements and personal reputations. Personal relationships among the participants played crucial roles in determining who trusted whom, sufficiently to enter into risky financial partnerships during a period when individual institutions' survival remained uncertain. Decades of business dealings, social connections, and mutual respect or animosity influenced willingness to cooperate, while past betrayals or disappointments created suspicion that complicated current negotiations. The physical exhaustion that affected all participants as the night progressed created additional pressure for reaching agreements that would allow the session to conclude, yet also raised concerns about making hasty decisions regarding enormous financial commitments during periods when judgment might be impaired by fatigue and stress. Morgan's advanced age and the other participants' physical limitations made extended negotiations increasingly difficult to sustain. The external pressure from the ongoing financial crisis provided constant urgency that prevented extended deliberation while demanding immediate decisions about complex financial arrangements that would normally require weeks or months of careful analysis. Telephone reports from subordinates monitoring market conditions and depositor behavior provided real-time updates that influenced negotiating positions and strategic calculations. The allocation of specific responsibilities among different institutions required detailed coordination that would enable effective implementation of rescue efforts while avoiding duplication or gaps in coverage that might undermine the overall effectiveness of coordinated intervention. Each bank's role had to be clearly defined, with specific financial commitments and operational responsibilities that matched their capabilities and constraints. International implications of the domestic rescue effort included considerations about how foreign investors and central banks would interpret American financial leadership's competence and coordination, affecting future access to international capital markets that American economic growth depended on. The participants understood that their decisions would be evaluated globally as evidence of American financial sophistication and crisis management capabilities. The moral hazard considerations that influenced negotiations included concerns about whether rescuing poorly managed institutions would create incentives for future reckless behavior, while questions arose about the fairness of using private resources to address problems that affected public welfare. These ethical dilemmas had no clear resolution, but required practical decisions about immediate crisis management priorities. Communication with government officials remained limited throughout the negotiations, reflecting both the administration's limited authority over financial markets and the participants' recognition that private coordination could implement solutions more rapidly than government action. However, informal consultation with Treasury Department representatives ensured that rescue efforts would not conflict with official government policy or legal requirements. The succession planning that occurred during the negotiations included contingency arrangements for continued coordination if initial rescue efforts proved insufficient or if changing conditions required additional intervention. Participants recognized that the night's agreements might represent only the first phase of extended crisis management that could require ongoing cooperation and financial commitment for weeks or months. Risk assessment calculations that guided individual institutions' participation decisions involved balancing the costs of contributing to rescue efforts against the potential losses from systemic financial collapse that would affect all market participants regardless of their individual financial strength or conservative management practices. These calculations required sophisticated analysis of interconnected risks and benefits that few individuals possessed the expertise to evaluate accurately. As dawn approached on November 3, 1907, the exhausted negotiators faced final decisions about specific financial commitments and implementation details that would determine whether their night-long effort would actually succeed in preventing the financial collapse that had seemed inevitable just hours earlier. Chapter 6. Economic Salvation. The agreement reached in Morgan's library as dawn broke on November 3, 1907, represented the most successful private intervention in American financial history, creating a $25 million rescue fund that would be deployed immediately to stabilize threatened institutions and restore confidence in the banking system. The participants emerged from their night-long ordeal with binding commitments that would test their financial resources while offering the only realistic hope for preventing complete economic collapse. The implementation of the rescue plan began immediately as participants returned to their institutions to arrange the complex financial transfers and operational coordination required for effective intervention. The Trust Company of America received the largest portion of support, enabling it to reopen with sufficient liquidity to meet depositor demands while demonstrating to the public that the institution had backing from the financial community's most respected leaders. Moore and Schley, the brokerage firm whose potential bankruptcy had threatened securities market stability, received emergency financing that enabled it to meet its obligations while maintaining operations that were essential for continued stock trading. This support prevented a collapse that would have eliminated a major market maker and created additional panic among investors who were already deeply concerned about market conditions. The psychological impact of the coordinated rescue effort proved as important as its direct financial effects, demonstrating to the public and international observers that American financial leadership possessed both the resources and the coordination capability necessary for managing serious economic crises. News of the private intervention helped restore confidence that had been shattered by weeks of panic and institutional failures. J.P. Morgan's personal role in managing the implementation of rescue operations required him to coordinate dozens of complex financial arrangements while maintaining public confidence through carefully managed communications that provided reassurance without revealing details that might create additional market volatility. His reputation for effectiveness and integrity proved crucial for convincing skeptical observers that the intervention would actually work. The stock market response to news of the private rescue effort was immediately positive, with securities prices recovering substantially as investors recognized that financial leadership was taking decisive action to address crisis conditions. The market rally provided additional confirmation that coordinated intervention could restore stability while creating positive feedback effects that supported continued recovery. International reaction to the American financial crisis and its private resolution was generally favorable, with European central banks and financial institutions expressing approval for the coordination demonstrated by American financial leaders. This international confidence helped stabilize currency exchange rates and maintained access to foreign capital that American economic recovery would require. The operational challenges involved in distributing rescue funds required sophisticated coordination among dozens of institutions with different operational procedures, legal requirements, and reporting systems. Emergency procedures had to be developed for processing large financial transfers quickly, while maintaining appropriate documentation and oversight to prevent fraud or misallocation of resources. Government officials' response to the private rescue effort was supportive but limited, reflecting both the administration's limited authority over financial markets and the recognition that private coordination had achieved results that government intervention could not have accomplished quickly enough to prevent disaster. Treasury Secretary George Cortelyou provided what assistance was possible within legal constraints while endorsing the private initiative. The legal framework that governed the rescue operations relied heavily on existing banking law and commercial practices that had not been designed for crisis management, requiring creative interpretation and innovative applications of standard procedures to accommodate the unusual circumstances. Emergency legal opinions had to be developed to ensure that participating institutions would not violate regulatory requirements while providing crisis assistance. Regional bank stabilization efforts extended the rescue model beyond New York to address pressures that were affecting financial institutions throughout the country as panic spread through telegraph networks and newspaper reporting. Correspondent banking relationships were used to channel support from major New York institutions to smaller regional banks that were experiencing depositor runs, despite having no connection to the original crisis triggers. The labor and industrial effects of successful crisis management became apparent as businesses that had been unable to obtain credit during the panic found renewed access to financing that enabled continued operations and employment. The rescue effort's success in maintaining financial system functionality prevented the massive unemployment and economic disruption that would have resulted from complete banking system collapse. Public communication about the rescue effort required careful balance between providing sufficient information to restore confidence while avoiding details that might reveal individual institutions' weaknesses or create opportunities for market manipulation. Newspaper coverage was managed through selective disclosure and informal guidance that shaped public understanding of events without compromising operational effectiveness. The cost accounting for rescue operations involved tracking millions of dollars in emergency financing across multiple institutions and time periods, creating unprecedented bookkeeping challenges that required innovative accounting methods and detailed documentation. These records would later provide crucial evidence for historians and economists studying the crisis and its resolution. Long-term implications of the successful private intervention included both positive effects on American financial credibility and concerning questions about the concentration of private power that had made such intervention possible. The rescue's success proved that coordinated private action could substitute for government financial management, but also demonstrated the potential dangers of allowing such enormous authority to remain in private hands without democratic oversight. Lessons learned from the crisis and its resolution influenced subsequent thinking about financial regulation, central banking, and the appropriate balance between private initiative and government oversight in managing economic stability. The demonstration that private coordination could prevent financial collapse provided evidence that some form of central banking authority was needed, whether public or private, to manage future crises effectively. As November 1907 progressed, the immediate success of the private rescue effort became increasingly apparent through restored market confidence, stabilized banking operations, and renewed access to credit that enabled normal economic activity to resume. However, the longer-term implications of such concentrated private financial power would continue to influence American economic policy and political debate for years to come.